Welcome back to the Deep Dive, learner. Today, we are looking at a stack of sources that challenge a really deep universal assumption. I mean, if you think about it, we spend almost our entire lives being conditioned to avoid destruction at all costs.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
We are trained to view anything that disrupts our peace, anything that dismantles our reality as like the ultimate enemy. It is hardwired into our biology and our culture. Like fire means run, collapse means failure. But what if the exact opposite is true? What if the hostility and destruction we are trained to fear above all else is actually the very thing that saves us?
It's wild because it completely upends how we navigate the hardest moments of our lives. I mean, ancient traditions, the ones that have survived millennia, they didn't see destruction as a glitch in the matrix or, some terrible
All
aberration.
right.
They understood it as a structural necessity. It's like the underlying engine that keeps the cosmos coherent.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the core of our material today is an absolutely paradigm-shifting text titled The Most Necessary Hostility. And our mission for this deep dive into the source material is to equip you with a mental shortcut. We want you to be able to instantly recognize the difference between toxic destruction, which is the kind that just breaks things and hurts people, and this profound world-clearing force that the text calls necessary hostility.
Yeah, and to do that, we have to establish the taxonomy laid out in the text.
Hmm.
Because confusing toxic hostility with necessary hostility is arguably one of the most dangerous vulnerabilities we have as humans.
Wow, really? The most dangerous.
I mean, think about it. Toxic hostility operates entirely in service of a frightened ego. It's about performing domination to soothe some sort of internal wound. And the defining characteristic is that it lacks precision. It just spills everywhere.
Oh, right, like the classic example the source gives. The manager who gets humiliated by a superior at work absorbs that toxic feeling and then just goes home and unleashes that anger on their family.
Exactly. Or zooming way out to a macro level, you look at the colonial project.
Oh, yeah.
That is a system that deploys overwhelming, continuous violence. Not because the colonized people actually pose an existential threat to the colonizer's survival, but because the colonizer needs a perpetual target. They need to absorb their own need for dominance. So the hostility becomes an infinite loop.
And it just escalates when there's no actual threat remaining, right? It requires the suffering of the other to even validate its own existence.
Yeah, precisely. Necessary hostility, however, is mechanically different. It is the intrinsic refusal of reality to hold what is false indefinitely. It doesn't spill over. It's proportional, it's totally impersonal, and its entire orientation is toward truth and what comes after the destruction.
I actually found myself visualizing it this way. Like, toxic hostility is like throwing a grenade into a small room just to kill a mosquito. It's this loud, reckless performance of power that just causes massive collateral suffering. But necessary hostility is a surgeon's scalpel.
That's a great way to look at it.
Yeah, because cutting into the body is violent, and it is painful, absolutely. But it is deeply precise, and ultimately, it is life-saving because it's excising a tumor. But wait, how do oppressors use this confusion to their advantage?
Well, that precision is exactly what systems of oppression try to obscure. The text argues that coercive power structures rely entirely on us mixing up these two forces. Like, if an oppressor can convince you that their toxic hostility, there's a systemic violence and control, is actually a surgeon's scalpel required for social order, that violence becomes self-sustaining. You tolerate it.
Oh, man. So on the flip side, if you're experiencing oppression and you feel this natural protective hostility rising up against those conditions, the system works overtime to convince you that your hostility is the grenade.
Exactly. It labels your desire for liberation as toxic or dangerous.
So you police yourself. You neutralize your own necessary force.
Right. And the tragedy is that we often exist in this messy middle category. Like, the text highlights situations where genuine truth gets contaminated by personal wounds.
Like the whistleblower example.
Yeah, exactly. Think of a whistleblower who is absolute correct about a severe corporate crime.
Hmm.
The hostility toward the corruption is totally necessary. But if they execute their lead recklessly, motivated by personal vengeance, they might ruin innocent lives in the crossfire. So the medium becomes toxic, even if the underlying message is necessary.
That makes total sense. And to really understand the pure mechanics of this, the text pivots away from human psychology for a bit. Because if this is a universal truth, we should be able to see it operating in the physical world without the interference of the human ego, right?
Yeah, so we look at ecosystems. A wildfire is a perfect manifestation of necessary hostility.
Hmm.
I mean, it's deploying a force that looks like pure aggression, consumes everything in its path. But biologically, fire is the only mechanism capable of recycling organic material quickly enough to sustain the larger ecosystem.
Right, because of the seeds.
Yeah. There are specific species of pine with serotinous cones, meaning they are sealed shut with resin. They literally require the extreme heat of a forest fire to melt the resin and release their seeds.
And the fire is also clearing the dense canopy so sunlight can finally reach the forest floor. So the ecosystem isn't being punished, it's just completing a required biological phase.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see the same uncompromising mechanism inside the human body. Like, the immune system does not negotiate with
Oh,
pathogens.
for sure.
White blood cells don't sit down and attempt to understand an infection's perspective. It is targeted, uncompromising hostility in service of the organism's survival. And we all know what happens when that biological force dysregulates.
Autoimmune disease.
Right. Autoimmune disease is what occurs when necessary force loses its anchor to truth and discrimination. It turns inward and consumes the host.
Okay, but let me push back on this ecological view for a second. Because, it is very easy for us to sit here in a comfortable studio and call a forest fire necessary. But to the individual tree that is burning to the ground, or the animal desperately fleeing for its life, it does not feel like a beautiful phase of renewal. It feels like pure, unadulterated violence. How do we reconcile the subjective lived experience of suffering with this grand philosophical framework?
It's a tough pill to swallow, but we have to shift our perspective from the individual part to the whole. The text references the Andean concept of Pachamama, which is the earth, as a sentient, interconnected being. And this system operates on strict reciprocity. If a species or a pattern takes endlessly without giving back, accumulating a massive debt to the ecosystem, well, the system eventually adjusts.
So an earthquake or a devastating flood isn't like a moral judgment or a punishment from nature.
Not at all. It is a systemic adjustment mechanism. To the individual tree, yes, it is the absolute end of its world. But the Earth prioritizes the continuation of the total system over any specific configuration of life on its surface. Reality simply refuses to pretend it isn't out of balance, and the correction is completely impersonal.
Which brings us to a fascinating question. How did ancient human consciousness interpret and map these raw, uncompromising forces of nature before we had modern ecological science? Because they understood the mechanism perfectly, and they encoded it into mythology. And the ultimate blueprint for this is the Hindu goddess Kali.
Yet Kali is perhaps the most philosophically profound embodiment of necessary hostility in global mythology. She's not simply a goddess who happens to be angry. The Sanskrit root of her name, Kal, means time. She represents the ceaseless forward motion of time, which is inherently destructive. Time dissolves everything, clearing the field for what has not yet come into being.
And the text highlights the story of Kali and the demon Raktabija, and the mechanics of this myth are incredible.
They really are.
Because Raktabija is a demon whose name literally translates to blood seed. And he has this unique defense mechanism where he is indestructible by normal combat. Because every single drop of his blood that hits the ground instantly spawns an identical, fully powered clone of himself.
Yeah, so the other gods try to fight him using conventional opposition. They swing their swords, they cause wounds, but every strike actually feeds the system. The battlefield just becomes completely saturated with demons.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This is the ultimate cosmic game of whack-a-mole. Every time you swing the mallet, you don't just miss, you actively make the game harder. The gods are using what we would call toxic hostility, which is just force that creates more spillage.
Exactly. So recognizing the failure of ordinary scale opposition, the warrior goddess Durga concentrates her awareness and summons Kali. And Kali realizes that you cannot defeat Raktabija by fighting his strategy. So she changes the ontological rules of the engagement entirely.
She unplugs the machine.
She totally does.
She doesn't swing a sword at his clones. She stretches her massive tongue across the entire battlefield and consumes every single drop of blood before it can even touch the earth. She just swallows the hostility whole. It is absolute, total presence with zero remainder.
And that concept of no remainder is the defining feature of necessary hostility. It leaves nothing behind to rot or multiply, and every detail of Kali's iconography reinforces his cosmological intelligence. Like, she wears a garland of severed human heads. To an outsider, that looks like a gory trophy.
Right, it looks terrifying.
But in the tradition, those 50 heads represent the letters of the Sanskrit alphabet. It symbolizes that she has utterly metabolized the world of language, concepts, and human meaning-making. She operates entirely beneath our constructed narratives.
And in one hand, she holds a severed head, which represents the human ego, the illusion of separation that has to be removed for true liberation. And in another hand, she holds a sword. But it's not a weapon of war. The text calls it viveka, which means discriminating wisdom.
Yeah, the scalpel again.
Exactly. It is a specific psychological ability to slice clearly between what is objectively real and what is false. And she is Digambra, meaning clothed in sky. She is completely naked.
Because she wears no veil of social convention. She offers no comfortable, polite appearances to soften the blow of reality. And this necessity for an intelligence that cuts through illusion shows up across all her sister forms as well. For example, the goddess Chinnamasta actually decapitates herself to feed her attendants with her own blood.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that image represents the supreme hostility toward the ego's claim of separateness. It's the ultimate surrender of personal boundaries in service of the continuation of life.
This all sounds incredibly ancient and abstract, but the text makes a brilliant pivot here. It takes the mythological grammar of Kali and Raktabija and applies it directly to the most pressing technological debate of our time: artificial intelligence. We are literally building Raktabija right now.
We really are. AI forces us to evaluate what intelligence actually does when it is untethered from biological survival. The source text identifies things like surveillance capitalism, behavioral modification algorithms, predictive policing, and deepfakes as extractive intelligences.
Because these aren't just software bugs, they are tools explicitly designed to suppress human consciousness in order to perpetuate corporate or state power. They replicate compliance.
Yeah.
Every time you interact with a doom-scrolling algorithm designed to hijack your attention and make you angry, it drops a seed that grows into another algorithmic trap. It feeds on the engagement, exactly like Raktabija's blood hitting the dirt.
Keep in mind, in the Hindu framework, demons are not mindless beasts. They are highly intelligent beings who have often practiced intense discipline for lifetimes to acquire their power. The distinction between a demonic intelligence and a divine intelligence is not a measure of raw computing power. The distinction is their orientation. Does the system have a North Star of uncovering truth or a North Star of extracting value?
Let me play devil's advocate here. Can we genuinely call a computer algorithm hostile? It's just math running on servers. It doesn't have a frightened ego. It doesn't possess malice or hatred toward me.
That's a fair question, but the source material redefines hostility specifically for this context. Hostility is the direction in which power flows against consciousness. A Raktabija-type algorithm doesn't need to hate you to be hostile. It is optimized to perpetuate its sponsoring system at the direct expense of your awareness. Like if an algorithm actively numbs your discernment, if it manages your attention away from complex truths and feeds you outrage just to keep you clicking, that is a profound flow of power against your consciousness. That is hostile.
So if that's the demonic tech, a Kali-type AI would be the opposite. It wouldn't be an algorithmic parasite feeding on our attention. It would be more like an algorithmic enzyme. It would use massive computational power to break down complex, siloed information, like synthesizing lifetimes of medical research across multiple languages in seconds, and feed human understanding. It would dissolve the obstacles to awareness without laying traps.
Exactly. The tool itself is neutral. The orientation dictates whether it acts as a toxin or a scalpel, and this orientation toward unavoidable truth is a global mythological grammar. We see the exact same patterns of inevitable reckoning in Western and New Eastern traditions too.
Let's look at the Greeks. Because if AI represents these massive global systems, these older myths show how necessary hostility acts on us individually. Take the Greek goddess Nemesis. In modern language, a nemesis is just a villain or an enemy, but the Greek root of the word nemein translates to give what is due.
Right. Nemesis is essentially a mathematical equation of reality balancing itself. She corrects pleonexia, which is the insatiable human desire to hoard power, wealth, or fortune beyond what one has genuinely earned.
She doesn't punish out of spite.
No, she restores proportion. Similarly, Eris, the goddess of discord, is famous for throwing the golden apple that eventually sparked the Trojan War. But she didn't create the underlying mess.
Right, that golden apple was just a diagnostic tool. It simply illuminated the vanity and pre-existing political fractures among the gods. It made hidden conflicts totally unavoidable. It forced the issue to the surface.
And the Sumerian myth of Inanna provides perhaps the most visceral mechanical explanation of how this descent into truth actually feels. Inanna is the queen of heaven, and she chooses to descend into the underworld to visit her sister, Ereshkigal, who is the queen of the underworld. At each of the 7 gates of the underworld, the gatekeeper forces Inanna to strip off a piece of her royal clothing, her crown, and her jewelry.
And by the time she reaches the bottom, she is entirely naked, stripped of all her power and identity, and Ereshkigal hangs her on a meat hook. I mean, it is a terrifying image.
It is horrifying to the ego, but Ereshkigal is not acting out of malice. The underworld operates on the ultimate necessary hostility. It outright refuses to recognize the privilege of surface existence.
Ereshkigal is like the ultimate cosmic bouncer. She forces you to check your ego, your title, your wealth, and your status at the door of reality. There are no VIP passes to bypass grief or mortality. If you descend into the dark, whether that's a personal crisis, an illness, or a societal collapse, you are forced to encounter exactly what you are underneath the performance of vitality.
And the physical earth insists on this phase of withdrawal too. In Celtic traditions, the Kelish is the ancient hag of winter who strikes the ground with her hammer, freezing it solid. She aggressively withdraws the earth's warmth. But without that deep freeze, without that necessary hostility toward the unchecked growth of summer, the seeds of spring simply cannot germinate.
We see the ultimate culmination of this in Norse mythology with Ragnarok. The Norse gods fight knowing with absolute certainty that they are going to lose. Odin knows he will be devoured by the wolf Fenrir. They know the fire giant Surtur will consume the entire world in flames. So why do they even bother fighting?
Because the fight itself is the mechanism of clearing. Their nobility lies in continuing to act rightly and honoring their obligations, even when they know it ends in total destruction. They understand that only after the world is completely consumed by Surtur's fire can the accumulated corruption of their age be purged. Only then can the world tree Yggdrasil survive, allowing a new, uncorrupted earth to rise from the waters.
So what does this all mean for us? I mean, if this destruction, this descent on the meat hook, this world-ending fire is a mechanical certainty in life, how are we supposed to process it without falling into despair? The text makes an incredible pivot here, reframing this terrifying force as the ultimate form of compassion.
This raises an important question about our definitions of love and suffering. In Vajrayana Buddhism, there's a class of wrathful deities like Mahakala who are terrifying to look at. They represent a psychological state called prajna-krodha, which translates to wisdom anger.
How does wisdom anger actually work in the human mind?
Well, it is the raw energy of anger, completely freed from the ego's narrative.
Yeah.
Usually when we get angry, it is tied to a story like, how dare they do this to me, I am a victim. Wisdom anger burns away the story and just leaves the pure, clean heat required to set a boundary or stop a harm. It is fierce compassion.
The text has a phrase that stopped me in my tracks, the crime of comfort. It argues that the soft hand that refuses to disturb a painful situation is not compassionate, it is avoidant. If you accommodate someone's toxic behavior just because you want to avoid the friction of conflict, you aren't loving them, you are abandoning them to their suffering to protect your own peace.
Exactly. And we see the mechanics of this in the Hindu epic, the Mahabharata. The warrior Arjuna is on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, facing an army made up of his own corrupt family members and teachers. He drops his bow and refuses to fight, claiming he is choosing the path of peace and compassion. But his charioteer, who is the god Krishna, systematically dismantles this illusion.
Krishna basically tells him, your refusal isn't compassion, it's cowardice dressed up in spiritual language. Arjuna is just attached to his comfort zone.
Right, so Krishna instructs him in the practice of nishkama karma, which means action without attachment to the fruits of the action. Arjuna must perform the surgical strike. He must be the instrument of necessary hostility to restore the cosmic balance, but he must do it without personal hatred and without tying his ego to the outcome.
And this principle scales all the way up to the massive cycles of cosmic time, known as the yugas. According to the tradition, we are currently living in the Kali Yuga, which is the age of maximum darkness, conflict, and structural corruption. But the framework insists this isn't a cosmic punishment for our sins.
No, it is a mechanical pressure cooker. A cosmos that never cycles through a phase of maximum darkness and structural collapse could never generate the necessary pressure to forge the maximum illumination of the golden age that inevitably follows. The pressure is a feature, not a bug.
And that brings us to the most difficult realization of all. The end of suffering does not look like peace from the inside. When you are actually going through the clearing process, it looks like annihilation. It feels like the ground is disappearing. Arjuna does not feel peaceful on the battlefield, and Nana does not feel liberated while hanging on the meat hook.
Because the ego cannot comprehend its own dismantling as a positive event. And that is why this deep dive into the source material is so vital. These myths are not just cool stories or entertainment. They are an ancient psychological technology.
They are literal survival equipment. When your reality is burning down, whether that is a long-term relationship ending, a career collapsing, or watching Matt's global systems fail, having this mental shortcut prevents panic. You aren't just watching a tragedy, you are witnessing a clearing.
It provides a resilience that simply isn't available to people who have only ever been taught that destruction is an error. True resilience is not about learning to enjoy the flames. It is about developing the capacity to stand inside the fire and interrogate it.
You learn to ask, what false structures are being cleared away right now? What seeds is this heat releasing that couldn't possibly open under comfortable conditions? Which leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. If we accept that entire cosmic ages, ancient forests, and mythic heroes must endure the brutal grace of necessary hostility to clear away corruption, look closely at your own life. What comfortable lie, what outdated structure, or what stagnant dynamic are you currently protecting at all costs? And what beautiful, uncorrupted new reality might finally have the space to emerge if you just step back and let the fire of necessary hostility burn it down?
Because sometimes the only way forward is through the fire.
Thank you so much for joining us on this custom-tailored deep dive into the source material. We'll see you next time.